What's going on, YouTube? Ferocity. I hope you guys are doing well. Something that has been on my mind lately, especially after the X-Defiant open session and branching out and playing other games, is the idea of skill gaps in video games and whether or not a wider skill gap is good or a nice minimal skill gap is better for the health of the community. And frankly, I look at every game that has gained popularity over the last 5 to 10 years, and I feel like games that have a little bit of a wider skill gap last longer, are a little bit more fun than games that have a very minimal skill gap. And unfortunately, a trend that I'm seeing, especially with some of the bigger titles in the gaming industry, the Call of Duties and the Halos, is that they've worked really hard to minimize their skill gaps so that they would be able to attract as many players as possible. Now, if you can humor me, I'm going to go into a bit of a story time here of when I first started playing first-person shooters. And the first-person shooter I started playing was Halo 3. And I felt extremely overwhelmed when I first stepped into Halo 3. And frankly, it took a very long time for me to grow comfortable in that game. But that growth was extremely rewarding. And this is back when Halo, in my opinion, had a much wider skill gap than it does today. Learning the little nuances of each map, learning little jump areas, learning timings of weapon respawns, those types of things were important to be able to master my skills. And as time grew, I got better. I learned more and more. I understood how maps flowed. I understood, when things would respawn, that type of thing. And that natural growth and that natural learning curve was extremely rewarding for me. Fast forward to today, where one of my favorite games right now is Dead by Daylight, and I think it's because it reminds me so much of that original learning curve that I had with Halo 3 and with all shooters. And frankly, this game has a very wide skill gap, and I love that. But then I look over at Call of Duty and I see a game that has worked extremely hard to try to minimize their skill gap as much as possible to then be able to be marketable to more people. And unfortunately, I'm going to be completely honest, it doesn't work. It's made the game infinitely worse. Anytime that they try to block out some sort of mechanic that increases the skill gap, it actively makes the gameplay far worse and far less enjoyable because you aren't able to earn that natural growth of getting better. That on top of skill-based matchmaking, of course, but that's neither here nor there. And then I look to another game that is extremely popular, Fortnite. That game has a skill gap. Remember when building was this huge meta? Yeah, there was a skill gap there. And guess what? It was one of the biggest games on the planet because of it. Because people felt rewarded for their growth within that game, for putting the time in. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is other games like Call of Duty and Halo, to their detriment, have tried to minimize this skill gap. And when I look at other games in the marketplace, X-Defiant, for it to be successful, needs to optimize their skill gap. It doesn't mean that it necessarily has to naturally make it wider or minimize it. It means it needs to find the optimal skill gap and not try to tinker with it too much. Allow the good players to have the advantage over learning players, and players that are learning, allow them to have that natural growth so it feels rewarding when they get to a certain level. That's what video games need. That sense of reward, something that a lot of video games have now taken out and are selling you for free. And that's the frustrating part, is I wish there was more reward, more incentive, which I've actually talked about on this channel. And it goes back into the skill gap as well. Allow players to have the incentive to put the time in, to retain their attention. And for whatever reason, we're trying to move away from these skill gaps because we're afraid new players might be shooed away. Look at everybody that's playing a Call of Duty or Halo or any type of game. At some point in time, they were a brand new player, and thinking that a wide skill gap is the reason why they won't play is so missing the point. It's kind of funny. And that's what's been so frustrating, watching both Call of Duty and Halo fumble over themselves trying to decrease their skill gap, is that it serves no one. It doesn't help the new player, and it doesn't help the veteran player. If anything, it pushes the veteran player away from the game, because what's the point of having a game that you've invested so many hours in if you're not significantly better because of tools that you've been able to master? It just seems like counterproductive. It seems, once again, I've said this many times when it pertains to Call of Duty, but it's change for the sake of change. But unfortunately, it's change that actively makes these games worse. Halo Infinite could have been a much better game. Unfortunately, it fumbled the bag because they were too busy trying to create a game that I don't even know what the vision for Halo Infinite was, but let's be honest here, let's call a spade a spade. The game flopped because it didn't have any content at launch, and then on top of it, they barely built off of it with their extremely long seasons. It just didn't work, and on top of that, the skill gap wasn't that rewarding, and it hasn't been ever since Halo 3, because they've tried to minimize and minimize and minimize to try to market to more people, and it hasn't worked. It has not solved any of their problems. If anything, it's made them less appealing to the masses. It's made them less appealing to veteran players, because one of the beauties of playing a game like Halo is mastering that skill gap. The same thing goes for Fortnite. The same thing goes for Apex Legends, and I hope the same thing will go for X-Defiant. I just want video games to become rewarding again for the players that want to put in the time and the effort to get better, to accomplish tasks. I think we need to do that to serve this community, to serve the players that play these games. And I don't know where we lost the plot or where we deviated away from the original goal of just allowing people to have fun and grow naturally in a game. Instead, we have to steer people on this very controlled path to get them to the destination that we curated for them. And it's disappointing because players should be able to naturally grow within the video games that they play. And unfortunately, we try to augment that growth as much as possible so they can become the optimal player that makes the developer as much money as possible. And that's the frustrating thing. All of this comes down to greed. It comes down to the lack of vision from a lot of developers. So that's it for today's video. That's all I kind of wanted to get out there, is I miss games that had skill gaps. I think they're a net positive for the community. I think that games that have a wider skill gap normally have a pretty healthy community, because you have the hardcores that are always grinding and always trying to get better, and you have the regular Joe Schmoes that have fun in the game too, because they feel rewarded for learning the little nuances of the game that they're playing. And I really like that, and gaming should have more of that. So that's what I'm going to leave you here with. The question for today: should games have skill gaps? Do you think a wider skill gap is better, or do you think a nice narrow, minimalized skill gap is the best way to retain players? Would love to hear your thoughts down below in that comment section. As always, guys, if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. If you want to see more videos from me, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.